Hello everybody, this is Justin from Stillness in the Storm here. I want to thank all of my patrons and supporters for keeping this channel alive. And today we're going to have a discussion about reincarnation and free will. And I'm here, well, I'm actually at a remote location at the Dauntless Dialogue studio with Adam Riva. Adam.
The Dauntless Dialogue headquarters, hidden in some hollowed out volcano somewhere in the middle of nowhere.
That's right, yes. We're very well protected.
What's up, guys?
So we're going to have a really cool discussion. I've had the fortunate opportunity of getting to know Adam quite well over the past few weeks, and let's just say that we have a lot of cool ideas we'd like to share with you. So we want to have a discussion today about reincarnation and free will. We're going to take a kind of philosophic approach. So as you probably are familiar with on both of our channels, we just like to take an idea and then entertain that idea and attack it from many different angles and explore from many different angles. So just as a preface or disclaimer to that, should be go without saying that just because we talk about something doesn't necessarily mean we believe it or we're trying to promote it. So reincarnation, really interesting concept. So for those of you who don't know, there's different versions of reincarnation out there. There's the traditional transmigration of souls concept, which discusses the idea that, you know, depending on the choices you make, if those are in alignment with natural law or divine law, then you could either grow and progress up in your next reincarnation, or you could regress and you could become like a slug if your next reincarnation.
And I think that comes out of Hindu tradition?
Yes, exactly, like a Vedic tradition, I believe. And then we have a more maybe modern day variant of reincarnation that was brought forth by figures like Dolores Cannon or Dr. Michael Newton, who kind of describe reincarnation as this soul evolution, and it's kind of like a cosmic initiation or school where we're making choices in this life, and that has helped prepare us for the next life, but there's no regression necessarily. We just keep slowly progressing forward. And then there's the idea that there is no reincarnation, so that's more of the Christian view. And then lastly, one last concept is this idea that reincarnation is a kind of soul trap, that the idea that you're supposed to continually reincarnate on the earth is itself a kind of like karmic trap that it was, you know, promulgated by negative ETs or negative spiritual beings. So we got a lot to talk about.
We have a lot to dissect, and I think one of the things that we should start with is some background on the historicity of reincarnation, insofar as you know, some of the ways that it was stamped out in Christianity, for instance. Maybe we can start there.
Yeah, great.
So let's talk about the early days of Christianity. So Christianity, there's actually, a lot of people don't know this, even Christians today, there's a lot of heated debate in the early days of whether or not reincarnation was actually true. Around the time of the Council of Nicaea, Emperor Constantine, who was the most powerful man in the world at the time, he converged the Council of Nicaea to decide what would go into the Bible. At the time, there were a lot of sacred texts all around the world that were recognized at the time as being sacred, divinely inspired. Some of those books were left out. This is where we get the phrase apocrypha from. Apocrypha, I believe in Greek, means that which is hidden from sight. I think that's the literal translation. So the apocryphal texts were those that were deemed as not sacred enough to be in the Bible itself. Books such as the 12 Patriarchs, the Book of Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Thomas. Now we'll get into some of the reasons why those were obscured from sight, why those were occulted, and maybe some of you know, the ramifications of suppressing some of those books. But let's look at what they were actually talking about. So for instance, the Book of Enoch was one of the first books, it might even be the very first instance of a book being written in first person. Enoch wrote about having some interactions with angels. He described them as angels. He talks about how they were knocking on his front door, how he needed to feed them food, how he needed to give them a bed to sleep in. He was actually tasked with being a translator or an intermediary between the angels of heaven and the men of earth. So that's kind of strange, because if they were true angels, wouldn't they just know how to speak English? Wouldn't there be some? Yeah. I mean, if they can speak in tongues, couldn't they just translate for themselves? And so, that's one doctrine that, in my estimation, was left out for a specific intention. The concept of extraterrestrials was a threat to the church.
Right.
Another threat came in the Book of Thomas. The Book of Thomas, again, wrote prolifically about reincarnation. It was actually accepted as part of the Christian doctrine in the early days until, I think, 533 AD. And there were other theologians at the time who fully supported and propounded on the idea of reincarnation. Now, this is just my speculation. This is just the current thought that I'm kicking around. Is I think in order for the church to have some control over the population, insofar as, controlling decisions and forcing them to pay taxes and forcing them to be subordinate citizens of society, they needed to constrain their free will through prescribing certain narratives. So what does that mean? If you believe in the concept of extraterrestrials, then you believe that we're not alone in the universe. So you believe that perhaps there's other sentient life elsewhere. And what would that mean with regard to Earth being the only place where Jesus incarnated?
Right.
Did Jesus incarnate elsewhere to save the souls of other extraterrestrials? So there's sort of a conundrum there. So feeling alone in the universe. And then insofar as the Book of Thomas and reincarnation as a core belief of Christianity being suppressed, they're basically convincing people that they have one finite life, YOLO, you only live once, and that you might as well just go for it here. And but there's the threat of hell, and so eternal damnation is quite a compelling way to influence someone's behavior, I would say. Totally. And so by making us feel like we are not only alone in the universe, but that we only have one life, you've constrained someone's self-conception temporally and spatially, and so you're now influencing them in a way that you can kind of control their behavior. I wanted to just outline one last premise here before we move on, is that I had mentioned the Council of Nicaea, and so Emperor Constantine, I mean, you're talking about the most powerful man in the world at that point, in the most powerful empire in the world. We hear about the sun never set on the British Empire. Well, the sun never set on the Roman Empire before that. And Emperor Constantine saw that there was a rise in the amount of Christians in the kingdom. And so one of the things that he decided to do was feign a conversion to Christianity for political purposes, so that he could maintain his seat on the throne. And this is when the Council of Nicaea was convened in, I think it was 325 AD. And that's where they had this vetting of the books that made it into the Bible, which I mentioned a moment ago. And so prior to, Roman Catholicism, there was Gnostic Christianity. And Gnostic Christianity, one of the core tenets of that was the concept of reincarnation. So I guess this distills it down to, when we think about the trajectory of spirituality over the ages, at least in the Western Judeo-Christian monotheistic traditions, you can see that there's been political maneuvers behind the scenes to basically cajole the population in a certain train of thought by prescribing a certain narrative to achieve a certain goal.
Right, exactly. And there's 2 points I want to touch on there. I think insofar as how free will deals with these questions about reincarnation, we orient ourselves based off of the maps of knowledge that we build about the world. So and just from a general perspective, not even getting into the whole control of religion concept, you and your ability to plot a course in life in general has to be nested inside some type of cosmic narrative. And if you can properly lay claim to an accurate cosmic narrative, then obviously you'll be able to, do good things in your life and live a fulfilling life. Well, I would argue that part of the socio-political aspect of reincarnation and what you might call like cosmic narratives is trying to paint a cosmic picture that allows the individual to be more easily controlled in the socio-political environment. And you could maybe even say that there was an advance in this socio-political control with the development of a reincarnation model. Because in the reincarnation model, you don't have the YOLO effect. You don't have the only live one effect. You can only live once effect. So you could live this life, try your best, really work at it, but you know what? It's okay. You got another life.
Yeah.
And now with the whole, one life concept, you better damn well sure you get your life together, because if you don't, you could burn in hell for all eternity. And that really, as far as free will, what it does is it places a lot of constraints. And then obviously you couple that with a very dogmatic kind of lifestyle where basically the religion is imposing controls on almost every aspect of life, and you've got a perfect situation for control there. So
you raised some interesting points. So we're starting to really get into the meat of free will and what is it and what are the constraints on it. And so think about a child who grows up in a family where he's told you can grow up to be anything. If you want to be an astronaut, commit yourself to it. Make incremental steps, achieving smaller and bigger goals so that you can be an astronaut one day. You can do it. Put your mind to it. That child, you could argue, at least in some sense, based on the narrative he's been prescribed, that he has a greater chance of becoming an astronaut than someone who is told you're nothing, you're worthless, you can't be anything, or you can't be an astronaut when you get older. And so part of this is, as we mentioned yesterday, is the juxtaposition between seeing is believing and believing is seeing. And so with respect to the way we perceive the world, and part of the way we perceive the world is how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive our own capacities based on how we evaluate ourselves, how we appraise our own abilities, that's going to play into the success or failure of goals that you're trying to achieve. So you could, in a pure sense, say, well, each child has the same free will to be an astronaut. But if you want to get a little more sophisticated than that, there's things that might suppress one's ability and thus, suppressing their free will.
Right.
We've mentioned this, I think, on my podcast over at Dauntless Dialogue, where there's temporal constraints on free will.
Right.
So if I tell you that you have 10 years to learn a second language, no problem. You can read some books, you can get some audio tapes and listen in the car, you can date a Spanish girl or something and learn Spanish. Now, if I tell you you have 10 minutes to learn that second language, I've constrained your free will. And so I think a part of this discussion, Justin, is going to be based on what are the rules of the game. And so there's rules here on Earth, this planet, based on the laws of physics, based on socio and economic mores and expectations, gender roles, all these different rules of the game that are going to kind of influence how you express yourself and how you can achieve certain goals. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you may touch on a lot of really great points. And one of the things that I've learned in my understanding of how free will kind of works is we tend to think free will is this total, absolute, omnipotent power, but that's not really the case. It's attenuated, it's stepped down. And really it's more of a situation where you have the ability to choose out of a described subset of choices, So obviously if you're instanced in the flesh, your free will is limited to what you can do with your own body and your own mind. But really, like you were mentioning, is that your free will is also governed by what you perceive as possible, And one of the things that the reincarnation or the cosmic narrative kind of does is it places inhibitions and limits on your free will. So for example, if you're coming from a you know, really ultra dogmatic, highly invasive religious background where basically you can't do anything unless it's been evaluated by some kind of religious authority, you don't really have a whole lot of free will. It's like, yeah, you could choose not to go to church one day, but now you're a sinner and you're an apostate, and we're going to have to, like, you know, label you a heretic or something like that. So what it seems to do, these cosmic narratives, is they augment what a person is capable of thinking about, and then what they seek to strive to do and set for their goals. So to look at, like, to enter the frame, okay, well, what do these different reincarnation narratives do? I would argue that there's some that have objectively better environmental support mechanisms. You know,
I would agree.
You're coming from the perspective that, you know, you only have one life, and if you make any type of mistakes, you're going to burn in all hell and for eternity. You basically don't have a whole lot of free will at that point, you know, and this is where this kind of, like, this idea that's thrown out there, and especially in the atheistic community, it's like, well, if God is really so great, then why can't we do anything? You know, if we really have free will, then why is my life so horrible? And
why is there death and suffering?
Exactly. So, and so to juxtapose that, so we have, on the one hand, we have a very deterministic, like, God is omnipotent and your free will is really an illusion because everything's predetermined on one end. And then we have, on the other end, a kind of, like, atheistic, there is no God, your free will is total and absolute, you know. Well, both ends of the spectrum don't really give you a whole lot of guidance, I would say, you know. I mean, you have a little guidance in the deterministic viewpoint, but in reality, you're just kind of like a mechanism. You're just a cog in a wheel, or a cog in a machine. A more middle path, I would say, is the Journey of Souls, kind of more modern day spiritual perspective that, you know, we have this life, and yes, we're growing in it and we're moving towards a path, and what we choose to do will change what happens in the future, but it's not this, like, oppressive constraint on our free will, you know. So,
and just because there are constraints on free will doesn't mean you have to interpret that as oppressive. Those constraints might be there for your own good. And so, you know, a parent might constrain their child's free will by holding their hand and not letting them run out into traffic. So yes, they've constrained that child's free will,
right,
but it's for their own good, and they're protecting their child. And there's a lot of ways. I wanted to expound a little bit on something you said about the limitations that are, we'll call them constraints on free will. And, you know, the best example I can give is, like, if there's a limbless person, like no arms, no legs, they're not going to be a world record setting Michael Phelps swimmer.
Right.
They're not going to be. And so they're constrained by their physicality. And I want to expound on some other constraints that we don't necessarily think about at first glance when we're talking about free will. Because we do like to fancy ourselves as, you know, apex predators, the cutting edge of evolution, the coolest kids on the block. But I think there's a dose of humility here, and that's a spoonful of medicine that a lot of people don't want to swallow, which is, you know, our memory is finite. Our skill sets are finite. If you're going to sharpen a skill set, you really need to specialize, and that would limit you in other areas. If you choose to be a specialist in mathematics, you're not going to necessarily be the world's best artist. So you have to choose a path, and that applies to everyone, no exceptions. And if you're going to be a generalist, well, then you're not going to be a specialist in any one thing, so you're not going to know all there is to know about anything. So we're limited by what we can know. We're limited by our physical being, like I mentioned with the limbless swimmer. We're limited in our longevity, so we only live so long in this lifetime before we have to kind of start over in reincarnation, before amnesia sets in. And you know, you could go on and on. We're limited insofar as there's only a finite amount of human beings on this planet to contribute to collective endeavors, such as science or spirituality. And I think I sent you a voice memo the other day with many more examples, which I'm blanking on. But there's so many ways that we're limited and that we're constrained in our free will, and that's not a bad thing. I like to think of the earth plane as a school where you're learning incremental lessons, but in order to learn those lessons, you sort of need to be channeled into the cause and effect sequence.
Right.
And so an example that I like to use is think about the choose your own adventure books. Like when I was young, I read Goosebumps books, and some of those you could choose your way to get to the end of the book, but you did need to read it sequentially. And, you know, different people might choose their own adventure differently than you, but you all ultimately end up from start to finish. Now, how does that relate to life? Well, there's a panoply of decisions that you can choose. There's myriad things you can do with your life and with your time and with your focus and with your talents and with your brain power. And having said that, you can't do everything. You can't do it all, nor can you do specific things. You can't do anything. You can do a lot of things. And that is just the nature of the game. If you're going to play football, you have to stay within the boundaries. You have to play by the rules.
Right.
Having said that, you can still express yourself in the game and be the best you can be to compete and to ultimately progress.
Right. Yeah, and I would say that even across all the various variations of reincarnation, where there is no reincarnation or there is a reincarnation, the same basic premise applies, which is that whatever you invest your time and energy into is what you're going to get good at. You know, so I would say that it seems as though free will is really, from our perspective as individuals, we kind of think about it as free will because we have these choices, but from across time, from like a creator perspective, an eternity perspective, free will is matching with purpose. And everything has, in a sense, for our level of life, I would say it's all kind of training us to use our faculties to direct our will in towards some type of coordinating purpose. And there's a really good example of that. I mean, if we, to use the specialization example you brought up, you know, if you decide to be a chef and I decide to be a chef and everybody decides to be a chef, well, we're all chefs, but nobody's a farmer. You know? Right. So, you know, it seems as though, and I'll pose this question to you, that free will is not as free as we might think, and that the idea of the other end of it seems to be this kind of cosmic narrative, this cosmic story component. So in your own musings about free will and really just your life purpose, have you thought about how your choices impact purpose and your direction in your life? Yeah,
well, absolutely. And so a part of the purpose and the function of free will is to develop a sense of morality. And I think in the exploration of possibility, in exploring cause and effect in this time-space reality, you're evaluating your decision-making process. And so you're reflecting on previous decisions and whether they obtained a certain goal for you or not, and whether, if you did obtain that goal, if it was what you expected it to be, and if it was satisfactory, and if it was sustainable. So you're charting out all of these synthesized ideas based on experience. So the free will is a refining of your own morality, because then you can start to assess the sustainability of those behaviors over time, how they impact others, how impacting others ultimately impacts yourself, which is where the development of the golden rule, which is in like 32 different religions, there's some corollary of the golden rule, and expressed in different words across different religions. That's a good example of that.
Totally.
And so I think as we develop our own sense of morality, we can refine ourselves. So what you commonly hear when you speak to individuals who are like past life regressionists or people who've gone through that experience and regressed and reflected on previous lifetimes, is that they recognize this sort of refinement of decision making, where they were a terrible person in a past life and they learned a lesson from it, or they didn't, and that that baggage, whether it's emotional or psychological baggage that they're carrying over from that lifetime, is now affecting them in this lifetime because they haven't resolved it yet, they haven't processed it. And so I think that's where a lot of healing takes place, is we start to refine our behavior and synthesize ideas so that we can understand and grasp morality.
Right.
An idea that I like to, a model that I like to propose to people to conceptualize this or to visualize it is the spring, like a spring shape, maybe even a scalar wave shape, which is different. It's like a three-dimensional sine wave.
Right.
The sine wave obviously goes up and down, peaks and valleys. So think of that in terms of a three-dimensional field where there's an X, Y, and Z axis. Why am I saying that? Well, because if you recognize that time is sort of cyclical and you do go through certain cycles in your lifetime or lifetimes, you eventually come back to a similar place to really test the merit of whether or not you've learned your lesson. So you might be presented with a similar experience, but this time around, you can choose to either act on prior wisdom or ignore it and repeat that mistake. And hopefully, ideally, as we ascend, as we refine, you're moving up this spiral, up this corkscrew. And so you're sort of coming back to a similar place on the y-axis, but did I say that right?
Yeah,
a similar place on the x-axis, but you've moved up that y-axis, hopefully to a place of higher synthesis and higher understanding.
Right. And personal power, I would say. I think, when we think about evolution, or growth or development, we tend to think about the idea that your ability to take actions to improve your quality of life or do the things that you want increases, so you get better at doing what you want, right? And one of the interesting things that the reincarnation perspective gives is it gives you a different perspective on your choices and your life path. So we were discussing this earlier, that if reincarnation is something real, why do we forget our lives when we reincarnate? And I would argue that part of that is because it gives you a different perspective. Can you really make a true choice of self-growth if you remembered the mistakes you made in the past? And to a certain extent, yes, you could argue you could, because we obviously have mistakes, and then I don't want to do that again, so let me change, But at a spiritual level, at a soul level, there's something different about that. We almost need to forget, because if you can imagine, if you've ever been through any kind of trauma or baggage in your life, or it's hard to deal with something, that really hinders your ability to think clearly. So I can imagine that if I did have access to all of my lives, that it would almost hinder my ability to make choices in the moment to a certain extent. Now, I'll preface that, or let me add another point addendum to that by saying, I also think that it's depending on development. So at our level of soul development, you might say, we are benefiting from forgetting, and works like the Law of One kind of discuss this, that there's this thing called the Law of Confusion, where we literally are intended to forget our life path, because that's the best environment for us to grow at our stage.
I think the Law of Confusion is the best way to summarize my life.
Exactly. I'll second that. But obviously this kind of rubs some people the wrong way, and this is where the kind of anti-reincarnation perspectives come in. It's like, well, if our past lives are so important to us, which they seem to be, if anybody's gone through a past life regression, as you were just mentioning, it kind of gives them a whole different perspective on life. Why are we not having these things? Why is this is not something that we're just implicit in our reality? And I don't know, ultimately. I don't have a definitive answer. I'm looking at it, and I think you are too, from what are the benefits from each perspective? And, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. So
yeah, and when I started the history lesson at the beginning of this conversation, I wasn't making an appeal to history fallacy. I wasn't saying, well, because back in time people believed in reincarnation, thusly it's true. I'm not saying that, nor do I know for certain that reincarnation is true. I'm exploring it, and I think that if you can bounce these ideas back and forth and examine the pros and cons of it, it's valuable. And then insofar as there's pretty compelling evidence that I've seen, there's some of the researchers, maybe you can remember their names,
Yeah, this Dr. Smith something. I was trying to remember it the whole time. I'm like,
Yeah.
I should remember his name anyway.
Yeah, comment below. But there's been researchers who've assessed the cases of various children and adolescents who claim to have past life recall, and what they found is that they're actually the images, the pictures, the photographs of the deceased person that they claim to have been are actually capable of passing police-grade facial recognition software that match the person who is making these claims. In addition to that, they can provide extremely confidential or candid information about the individual's life, friends, residences, particular situations that they would have no access to and no way of knowing otherwise. In addition to that, they've often possessed certain scarring if the individual died in a certain way that would leave a certain, I guess the scar was like indicative of the injury, I guess is a good way to say it.
Right.
And so there's I've been exposed to some pretty compelling we'll call it evidence, not proof, but evidence, as well as, there's a lot of people in the exopolitical community who discuss how some of the extraterrestrials and who've made contact with them are totally convinced of this. Again, not saying that is proof, but, if some of these civilizations who've passed us by 10 million years, if that's kind of their conception of spirituality and the progression of the soul journey, then again, that's kind of compelling, especially if their civilization is a peaceful one, or especially if their civilization is extremely advanced and harmonious. Well, maybe they have understood certain things that we don't understand here.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a great place to jump into the practical aspect. So now we've kind of just explored, what is reincarnation? What does it mean? How does an idea of reincarnation or a cosmic worldview affect your choices in life? And now I want to get into the kind of the pragmatic or practical perspective, so what does choosing one of these life paths actually get you? And we'll probably leave it at there, I think. So what I would argue is that there are objective differences to how you view the cosmos and your place in it, your relationship to all that is. And, if you view, we'll take the most extreme dark version just to see what it looks like. Look, if you think that reincarnation is a giant soul trap, that we're effectively all in a kind of hellish purgatory on the earth where we're minions and being energy harvested by these dark Draco beings that are just forcing us to reincarnate in these horrible bodies all the time. What does that do for your free will? I mean, I would argue that narrative greatly limits your ability to live a meaningful, fulfilling life. And you'll probably justify a lot of escapist, pleasure-seeking activity to deal with the pain that world brings you, to the point where you may not be developing yourself at all. You might not even care about helping other people or developing an altruistic view or trying to make the world a better place, because what's the point? It's all just a reincarnation soul trap, right? So
can I just
please,
append something to that? So Justin and I mentioned we like to kind of look at the underpinning philosophically of certain ideas and the ways in which they play out and the way that they kind of mold our characterological structure. And so one of the things that I like to do is when I'm assessing the merit of different ideologies, I say, well, what is the logical conclusion of those things? So something like, that kind of fatalistic worldview, or an atheistic worldview, or a deterministic worldview, they sort of negate free will. And when you negate free will, what's the next logical conclusion? Well, you're sort of apathetic from that.
Right.
And if you're apathetic, you sort of lean towards perhaps solipsism or postmodernism. If you lean towards that, you lean towards violence and self-defeat eventually, inevitably. And maybe I jumped over those really quickly. I could flesh them out if I had to. I'm willing to defend that. But there's sort of a slippery slope of ideas that one leads to another, kind of like socialism leads to communism. And I would, I guess, invite our audience to consider free will as A, more sophisticated than at face value, and B, as something which is, beneficial. And in recognizing that there's benefit we receive from free will that's constrained, you can now work with that. You can actually use it as a tool in your life for self-refinement.
Precisely, right. So from an epistemological perspective, epistemology is the philosophy of how do we know what we know, how can we discern. It's effectively the science of discernment. And one of the conclusions that these experts in discernment have come to is that you can't really prove something as truth 100%. You have to do your best to gather evidence to support a conclusion that you think is true, but ultimately you have to just pick something and run with it and see what it does for you. So that's the pragmatic perspective. So I've explored all sorts of ideas. I started off as kind of like an agnostic, almost mystical spiritualist very early on in my life. Then I was exposed to religion, kind of threw everything spiritual out the window and was very atheistic. And when I entered that atheistic frame, it made my life really dark. And I felt kind of like I got into drugs. I started doing, all sorts of pleasure-seeking escapist activities for various reasons, but certainly my dark outlook on life was part of that. And it didn't really yield a whole lot of beneficial things in my life. So, just from a life benefit perspective, fulfillment perspective, we can't really know with 100% certainty which one is true. But you can choose one that markedly improves your life subjectively. And that's the kind of question I'm posing to you as the audience is, ask yourself which version of reincarnation it feels the best to you, that ennobles you and empowers you to take the reins in life and recognize you have the power to change things. And I would say that a fiercely deterministic, ultra-religious view really hinders you in your ability to make choices. A fiercely, atheistic, materialistic view makes life seem almost meaningless and fruitless. And the one that I choose, and I'm not saying that this is the truth, but the one that has yielded me the most empowerment is the kind of Journey of Souls, Dolores Cannon perspective, which is that I came in this life for a reason, for a purpose. I have these previous lives that I've been accumulating knowledge and information for. And if I embrace that purpose in my life as much as I possibly can, not only will I feel fulfilled, but my ability to express my free will in greater degrees of potency and effectiveness increase. And one last thing I'll mention on this is that it's a harmonization. It's not just my free will and everybody else is just an automaton and I'm the only one who has free will. No, you have free will, I have free will, we all have free will. If that's true, and if we acknowledge that is true, how can we work together to ensure that everybody has the maximal free choice and free will?
And that'll be another episode.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's a great discussion, Adam. Thank you so much for inviting me to your studio and let me work off your stuff. And thank you so much, everybody, for listening to the discussion. Really curious to hear any of your thoughts. Please feel free to leave comments in the comment section. You can shoot me an email at sitsshow, sitsshow@gmail.com. And if you want to shoot some feedback over to Adam, what's your contact information?
Yeah, you guys can check out Dauntless Dialogue. It's on YouTube. It's also dauntlessdialogue.com. As I mentioned, it's basically a philosophically oriented website. We do things like current events. We have a show called Breakaway where we interview secret space program whistleblowers. We talk about cool stuff like we are right here. And we'd love to see you guys over there. If you want to head over, check out some of my stuff. We've got some podcasts that we did together. We actually shot one yesterday that we're going to be posting. I think we did 3 episodes together already.
Yeah.
So head over to Dauntless Dialogue and check that out too.
Thanks, everybody. Stay vigilant.
Thanks, guys.
Much love. Take care. Until next time.